When it comes to ADDIE, when it comes to doing instructional design work, I feel like there's two camps. Like you're either more in like the iterative sort of SAM model, which is not what we'll be talking about because that's not the camp I sit in. And then there's the ADDIE model. And ADDIE, and we'll go into all of this in more depth, but it really stands for A is for analysis, D is for design, the second D is for development, I is for implementation, and then E is for evaluation. ADDIE is not linear, and yet it's presented in this linear way, which is how I sort of remember it. So just know that at any point in time, as you're going through the process, you may be thinking about another piece of the pie, specifically about like evaluation. So when it comes to the analysis and when it comes to the design, you're always wanting to be kind of thinking like, all right, like, how am I going to know whether or not this training is effective? And what does that success really look like? So you may start developing or sketching something out like at the very, very early stages, maybe get that in front of somebody to get their sign off, which is probably technically somewhere between the design and the development stage. You might do that in the analysis piece. Implementing, you might do quick, rapid prototyping. So just so that you know, like these blocks exist, and yet they kind of move all around depending on the needs of your projects. So we'll go into all of this a little bit more, but just know this is ADDIE. Now I think this is what ADDIE actually looks like in like a day-to-day scenario, in an instructional design scenario. And I'll walk you through this. But over here is really where you get kind of like the, hey, we need training. Like somebody tells you that, whether that's a client, whether that's a stakeholder, whether that's a leader that's like, hey, our sales are down this quarter and we don't know why. Like we need more training on that. That sort of usually prompts like a project request, which again, we'll talk about later. I think that comes next week. But that's really what all sort of begins everything. That's the catalyst. We need training. That really like kicks off the A. So over here, you'll see I have a little key, but I'll walk through each of these. The yellow is often like an ID lead. Maybe it's a manager. Maybe it's a PM. It's somebody who's probably been doing the work a bit longer than like a newbie instructional designer. And each of these phases, in this case, like meeting with the stakeholders to figure out, okay, cool. Like, tell me a little bit more about your project request. Like, who's the learner? Like, when does this need to actually be pushed out? That's usually someone who's not, especially junior. Like that helps that it's a more senior person. Sometimes there's a few folks. Really talking about like conducting a needs assessment or a needs analysis. We'll talk about that more as we get into analysis, but that's really like often when a project request comes across our desk, like the stakeholder that says, oh, we need new sales training, that might not actually be the issue. That might not actually be the reason that sales are down. And so this is really more of like the investigative piece. The upfront part is like, let's make sure that we actually are designing for something that's going to work. So you're telling me one thing, I want to validate that. I'm going to do my own research. Like, let's figure out what this really is. Who are these learners? What do they actually need? But again, it's often done by someone who's a little bit more senior. So if you're a brand new instructional designer, probably no one's going to be sending you out saying like, please do a needs analysis for your very first job. It would just be way too hard. Scoping the fidelity really kind of plays into analysis as well. So, okay, you're telling me you need new sales training. Is that going to be a 10-minute long e-learning course that we push out, we make maybe an articulate rise? Or is that going to be a 2-day long in-person, really robust training session where we have facilitator guides and we have, extra speakers coming in and we're doing production, someone's coming in. So fidelity meaning how big or little, like what is the scope? That's really part of analysis. And so again, as a new instructional designer, that's probably not something that you're going to be making the call on, because usually it's like, we want someone who's not their first rodeo, figuring out what that fidelity is. You might not even know what fidelities exist. So this is really kind of like more that lead PM manager, but also like in this era where we're just pushing out rapid development so quickly, that's not always the case. Like you may actually have to start doing this pretty much right off the bat when you get your new job, because I really think we're making a transition from more instructional designers in this lane, e-learning developers in this lane, to just really learning experience designers as a whole who are doing kind of all the things. So even though down here in this key, I'm like, okay, this is this person, this is this person, this is this person, really as a learning experience designer, which is what I am and what I hope that you all aspire to be, you really should be able to do all of this. And unfortunately, companies think we can do all of it and we can't always, or it takes a little time. All right. Also in the A, that's gathering source material. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And it's conducting Sme interviews. So really talking to people who know what they're talking about. So if we're talking sales training, maybe we're talking to the leader of a sales training team and we're saying, okay, like what is actually happening on the ground floor, or what kind of material do you give to your folks right now? Do they have like one pagers? Do they have notes written all over their desks? Like what does that really look like? And source material is just where are you getting the content for your course? Whether that's in somebody's brain, which sometimes it is through these Sme interviews, you'll get that. Often there's like an old deck, like a PowerPoint deck, or there's like a research paper, or there's notes, or there's like some god awful wiki page that you have to go to and it's just grotesque. That's source material. So that's why I say when it comes to A, it's not the fun stuff, but it's such valuable learning. And if this part isn't done well, the rest really crumbles. So we're going to spend a lot of time in the first couple weeks talking about the A. Moving on to this first D, which is design, what I really want for everyone to remember, and this was the hardest thing for me to get, is that D for design does not necessarily mean you're making something beautiful. Like that doesn't, it's not always visual design. Design meaning more intentionally considering the structure of something. Usually for this, it's creating those learning objectives. It's talking about what does the outline look like? What is the storyboard going to look like? I think the schedule part, I kind of tried to move these like slightly between the A and the D. Creating a project schedule, I think is kind of like a blend between those two things. It's really more on the A, but like the scope of your project is going to determine the project schedule, and then how much you're able to do under that period of time is going to determine, all right, like what does your outline look like? What does your storyboard look like? We're considering evaluation here. We're maybe doing some sketches, some mock-ups. But these first two lanes, like this is what we're really going to talk about. Moving on, this is more like actual development. And I have some better slides so I don't lose a bunch of people on this, but this is when we're doing the building. It's the making. Like we've laid the framework out. We've scoped the land. Now we've built the blueprints, if you will, with the D being that. Now it's time to start like constructing. It's time to start really building. So that's what this D is. I usually tend to think that there's an alpha, a beta, and a final. That's what I was taught, a V1, V2, and a final. And usually like audio, video, anything that's really incorporated like that in your course, that's going to start happening alongside these. So this is building stage. And you'll see over here, I say that this is often a developer responsibility, not always. And often like today, this is going to be a responsibility if you're an instructional designer, but you may have a media specialist or you may have a development team that's really going to help you off at this point. The I and the E, these are less things that you'll probably be like very familiar with or even exposed to when you first start things out. I being the implementation. So this is the course rollout. What does that actually look like? And then the enrollment process. So which groups are getting enrolled into this? What LMS are we using? Do people get an email notifying them that they're enrolled in a course? Like what does that actually, like the experience look like as you pushed out? This is launch day. And somewhere between launch day and this E, which is evaluation, this is basically like where people have finished the course. Like, all right, like you've completed the course. Now it's time to really evaluate and possibly revise what it is that we've done. So this is really useful for me. And I'd like to probably give you all like this is a one pager just to kind of like have on your desk as like a reminder. Hey, this is what sort of happens when. These steps don't always happen in every single project. Sometimes you skip a few, but really don't skip the A and the D. Quick mention here that the LMS admin, this is becoming like a more common role that I'm seeing, somebody who's actually helping with the implementation piece. So like that means that the same person who's putting all their brain power toward conducting a needs assessment isn't necessarily having to enroll learners in a course. It really shouldn't be that way. I mean, these are very different skill sets. So, but you sometimes have to do what you have to do.